The judge's gavel hadn't even cooled when the courtroom doors exploded open. Armed officers stormed in, and all eyes turned to the man who had just humiliated Karoline Leavitt on live television. "Judge Milton Granger," a voice cut through the tension like a blade. "You are under arrest." Gasps echoed off marble walls as the robe-wrapped symbol of power stood frozen, jaw slack, face drained of color. And Karoline, still in handcuffs, watched in silence as the man who tried to destroy her was suddenly stripped of everything. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The courtroom hummed with a quiet, simmering hostility, as though the walls themselves were bracing for impact. Sunlight sliced through the tall, narrow windows, painting long shadows across the polished floor, shadows that seemed to creep toward Karoline Leavitt as she stood, unflinching, at the defendant's table. Her fingers rested on a neatly stacked binder of documents, evidence she knew would never see the light of relevance today. Not under this judge, not in this room. Across from her, Judge Milton Granger loomed like a statue carved from entitlement. His eyes, small and dark beneath thick brows, held no trace of judicial impartiality. They were the eyes of a man who had long forgotten what fairness even meant. Granger's rise to the bench had been greased by years of quiet deals and quieter silences, campaign donations funneled through shell companies, handshakes traded for rezoning approvals, favors exchanged behind the velvet curtains of exclusive golf clubs. He didn't fear scrutiny. He expected immunity. Karoline, by contrast, represented the one thing he couldn't buy: exposure. Her investigation had struck dangerously close to home: a leaked ledger, a digital trail leading to Granger's involvement in laundering corporate bribes through rural real estate flips. She hadn't come to court to play victim. She came to confront the machine head-on, but the machine had already anticipated her. "This court," Granger announced with theatrical disdain, "will not be hijacked by populist hysteria." His voice echoed sharply, each word calibrated for maximum condescension. A handful of reporters, some seasoned, some fresh from cable panels, glanced at one another with raised brows. They recognized a show trial when they saw one. Still, the cameras rolled. Karoline opened her mouth to object, her voice steady, deliberate. "Your Honor, I have authenticated documents tracing the financial—" "Silence!" Granger snapped, gavel slamming down like a thunderclap. "One more word and you'll be held in contempt." Her lips pressed into a firm line. The room was not a courtroom. It was a stage, and Granger was the star, basking in his moment of punitive glory. Then came the blow. "Ms. Leavitt," he said with a smirk that curled like smoke, "you are hereby held in contempt. Bailiff, escort her out. The cameras caught it all. The judge's grin, the cuffs, the poise of a woman who knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning." The holding room reeked of bleach and old despair. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile pallor on cinder-block walls that bore the scuffs of too many unjust detainments. Karoline Leavitt sat on a cold metal bench, her wrists zip-tied, ankles uncrossed, back straight. She refused to slouch. She refused to give the surveillance camera in the corner even a sliver of satisfaction. They could bind her hands, but her will, her voice, her clarity of purpose, untouchable. Her pulse thudded, not with panic but with the slow, burning tempo of outrage. Her mind replayed the courtroom scene again and again, not to relive the humiliation, but to analyze it, like a battlefield tactician reviewing a failed skirmish. Judge Granger's smugness wasn't just cruelty, it was calculation. He hadn't feared exposure, he had flaunted his impunity. And yet, that arrogance might become his downfall. Karoline's thoughts sharpened, cutting through the noise of emotion. She had expected something like this. Not the exact manner. She'd hoped the truth would speak louder than power. But she was no stranger to the way corrupted institutions devour threats. That's why, days earlier, she'd quietly handed off a flash drive to the only person she trusted with it, Detective Ryan Callahan. Callahan wasn't just a cop. He was a former federal investigator turned local reformer, a man who'd lost friends and status for refusing to play ball with political elites. Granger's name had already crossed his radar in whispers and anonymous tips, but nothing stuck. Not until Karoline walked into his office with a sealed packet and steady eyes. "If I don't walk out of that courtroom with my dignity intact," she'd said, "make sure the evidence does." And now, sitting in silence, listening to the distant echoes of doors and footsteps, she took strange comfort in the quiet. Granger thought he had won. The press would get their headlines. Her critics would gloat. But something deeper had shifted beneath the surface, like tectonic plates groaning before an earthquake. She didn't feel defeated. She felt ready. Outside this sterile cage, the truth was on the move. The man who'd ordered her humiliation would soon face more than inconvenient questions. She just needed to wait. Not long, not forever. Her hands were bound, but the fuse was already lit. The doors burst open, not with chaos, but with precision, boots striking polished marble in measured cadence, the dull gleam of badges catching courtroom lights. A ripple of disbelief swept across the chamber as Detective Ryan Callahan strode forward, the quiet fury in his eyes slicing through the courtroom's stale air like a blade. His voice, cold and resolute, fractured the silence. "Judge Milton Granger," he declared, every syllable an indictment carved in stone, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, and obstruction of justice." The air turned heavy. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The reporters froze, their pens mid-scratch, their jaws slightly ajar. Lawyers shifted in their seats, unsure whether to object or bear witness. Somewhere near the back, a phone clattered to the floor. A single camera operator, his instincts sharper than his nerves, kept rolling, the red light blinking like a silent siren. Granger did not rise. He didn't reach for the gavel. He stared at Callahan as if the detective had walked out of a nightmare he thought buried. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "You can't! This is outrageous!" he barked, but the strain in his voice betrayed him. The judge who had just ridiculed Karoline Leavitt in front of the nation now looked like a man drowning in a tide he never saw coming. But the evidence had already surfaced, piece by damning piece. Callahan had it all. Bank transfers routed through Caribbean shells, a recorded phone call with a developer named Hugo Maddox. "Just make the ruling go away, Milton, and the usual bonus hits your account." Granger hadn't known he was being watched. He had underestimated the very machine he had corrupted for years. The final nail, encrypted email threads detailing Karoline's contempt charge, planned days before her court date. A tactical humiliation, not a legal decision. He hadn't just abused his power. He had weaponized the court to bury truth. Bailiffs approached Granger like surgeons preparing an incision, efficient, emotionless. The clink of handcuffs echoed across the chamber. Granger stood, stiff and trembling, his robe dragging like a costume come undone. When he turned, whether by instinct or shame, his eyes met Karoline's. There was no hatred in her gaze, no gloating, only clarity. Where his authority once dwarfed her, now he seemed diminished, exposed, fragile. The empire he'd built on secrets had collapsed in a single breath. And Karoline? She didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She stood taller in that silence than he had ever managed from the bench. The footage spread like wildfire, uncut, unfiltered, undeniable. Within minutes of its upload, it tore through social media feeds, news aggregators, and encrypted group chats like a match to dry timber. Judge Milton Granger, once untouchable in his black robe, was seen flanked by law enforcement, his wrists cuffed, his scowl stripped of all authority. And standing behind him, calm and unmoved, was Karoline Leavitt, no longer just a commentator but the face of something larger, a reckoning. Hashtags erupted in a coordinated chorus. Hashtag Karoline was right. Hash Granger exposed. Hashtag Court of Public Truth. Memes followed, but so did essays, threads, and editorials. Conservative outlets praised her bravery. Independents marveled at her preparedness. Even typically indifferent voices took pause. Overnight, Karoline's name became not just a search trend. It became a question people asked themselves. What am I willing to stand for? In the days that followed, silence crumbled like plaster. Clerks, paralegals, even former prosecutors stepped forward. Whistleblowers who had buried their unease for years now found their courage. Documents long suppressed began surfacing. The Granger takedown became a catalyst, unearthing a rot that had long disguised itself as tradition, precedent, or decorum. And still, Karoline didn't claim the moment for herself. She didn't bask in the media blitz. When the networks called, she didn't gloat. She waited. Then that evening, she went live. Not from a studio, but from her modest home office. A bookshelf behind her. No makeup team, no teleprompter. Her voice was steady. "This was never about me," she began, addressing an audience that had swelled into the millions. "It's about what we allow to go unchecked. It's about the cost of silence and the power we hold when we choose not to look away." Her words weren't crafted for applause. They were a hand extended, an invitation to speak, to question, to fight, not with fists, but with truth sharpened into action. She didn't look like a revolutionary, but to many, she had become one. By morning, advocacy groups mobilized. Law schools announced ethics audits. Judges across the country faced renewed scrutiny. The justice system, long insulated by procedure and formality, found itself exposed under a new kind of light, one cast not by institutions, but by the people. And at the center of that shift stood Karoline Leavitt. A woman once mocked in a courtroom now stood outside its gates, free not just in body, but in principle. She hadn't broken the system. She'd forced it to see itself, and that changed everything.